This is the video podcast for Chapter 19 on ecological models. So far in the modeling portion of this course, we've been focusing on hydrological models, and then we've been essentially parameterizing the role of land cover and land uses, and that's really the extent to which we've seen a role for ecology, so to speak, in hydrological models. Now, before that, of course, we had more interactions, but still, it was largely associated with just vegetation, and the role of the vegetation boiled down to things like evapotranspiration or just transpiration, interception, root uptake of water perhaps, or its role looking at intercepting snow and radiation effects with all associated with snow. So that's just a brief summary of how we've looked at ecology in hydrological models. Now I want to totally flip the paradigm here, so to speak, and look at the role of hydrology in ecology models. So there have been ecological models for a long time, just as there have been hydrological models. So how have ecologists viewed the physical environment in their models? And I just want to preface before moving forward to say that we're going to be focusing on species-oriented, population-scale ecological models. And so there are many, many types of ecological models, just as there are many more hydrological models that we haven't really covered in the class. So this presentation is really just a very first basic introduction to the topic of ecological models, since I know that many of you really have probably never come across them. Okay, so what constitutes an ecosystem? This is just a little bit of a reminder from the very first video podcast. Remember that you have individuals that are all part of, share from the same species, and they're maybe in the same geographic region, and so they form a population. When you have populations of different species, then how they are together creates a community. When a community of species made up of populations and individuals interacts not only amongst themselves but with the physical chemical environment, then that constitutes an ecosystem. So individuals are basically doing what they need to do individually, but when you sum all that up together, you get what appears to be a holistic effect with a lot of interactions. Some of the things that can affect communities, as you can see in the list here, the present composition, so what we call like the structure of that community, the past composition. We've seen both in hydrology and now in ecology that past conditions can affect the present. That leads to the concept of like autocorrelation. Surrounding areas, so are individuals moving in or out from surrounding areas. Resource availability, that's going to affect the ability of a population to grow, or an individual to grow, or the health of the individual. Disturbance regimes have been a theme of this course, so how frequently do they come, how big of a disturbance are they, what's their duration and magnitude, and so forth. And then it's always important to remember that just like in hydrology, ecology is fraught with random events, what we could just call stochastic factors. There's always a chance that an individual will die, and so we have to be mindful of that too. When we look at species interactions, at the community level, some of the things that we could think about are on this list, and so you can pretty much read this on your own, but commonly we often are most focused on competition, which can be within an individual species, like individuals competing with each other, or it can be competition between species. Predation is another one, and you can look through the list, so I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so the typical goal of ecological modeling is to predict community composition. So again, community composition is like the population size of all the different species that are present in that community. Now, how do you do that? Well, of course, just like with hydrological models, there's a wide range of tools that are available. Statistical models, historically driven, models where current population is a function of the past. And then there are these other equations that I'll show you, logistic equation, Latka-Volterra, and then individual-based ecological models. So I'm going to work you through these the initial models I'm going to show you have very little explicit, physical, chemical, environmental factors, but then as we move along, we'll see more of that come into play. Okay, so from a statistical perspective, of course, we can draw on all the same things that we saw from Chapter 16. We can have stochastic, statistical, empirical, and all that kind of stuff. So instead of solving for like a water flux, like runoff as a function of precipitation, you could just solve for population size. And the current population size could be a function of the past population size. It could be related to interactions with predators or prey, environmental conditions, or it could be just purely stochastic, in which case you just need to know probability distributions and their parameters. Let's look at a very simple model where current population size is a function of past population size, and we're not interested in just one species, but the interactions among several species. Now in this model, I'm showing it to you in the form of matrix algebra. And so if you haven't taken like a linear algebra class with matrices, then this is maybe a little bit difficult or new to you. But this is an equation where x prime is a column. You can just think of it as a column of numbers. If you're familiar with the term, we could say that this is a vector. And so this column of numbers would have the abundance of each species of interest. So let's say you had 5 different species, and so what is the population size of each of those 5? You could just make a column of those numbers, and that would be what x prime is. That's the population size either let's say today, okay, and then x is the exact same thing. It's the population size yesterday. So the population size today is going to be some function of the population size yesterday. So then what's capital B? Well, capital B is the effect of each species on each other species, as well as the effect of a species on itself. So the past population sizes, presumably, then there's all these interactions among those individuals, and then that leads to new population sizes. This is a model that isn't explicit in what those interactions are. It's just one that results in a change of population size. So the abundance of a species, let's say I, is the weighted sum of the past abundances of many different species, because these other species' population sizes create competition, predation, and all those other interactions. Okay, so let me show you how this looks mathematically. And again, if you've never seen a matrix, then this is new to you. So I'll try my best to explain it in 2 different formats. The primary format that's on the top is the matrix notation. The format on the bottom is an easier algebraic notation, and they're saying exactly the same thing. So here's a column that shows at time 1 the abundance of 5 different species. So SP1 would be a population size, like there's 1,000 individuals of population 1. There's 200 of population 2, whatever it is. So you have that set of numbers, and that's in this column. If you take that column and so I'm going to, with my hand, that's vertical. If I flip it sideways and then interact it with the first row, then that's the mathematical function to predict species 1 at time 2. So species 1 at time 2 equals negative 0.06 times the value of species 1 at times 1 plus 0 times the value of species 2, 0 times the value of species 3, and so on. Then, when we flip that, we can go down to the next column for species 2. Species 2 at time 2, its population size equals 0.06 times species 1 abundance plus negative 0.07 times species 2, and so on. And so the equations below show you how that works out and yields a set of 5 equations. The matrix form up here is ultimately a more compact mathematical expression that simplifies computations if you're using software like R or MATLAB or something like that. And so let's look at the numbers carefully. So negative 0.06, this means that for species 1, its population size at time 2 is going to be going down, and everything in the first column is the effect of species 1 either on itself or on other species. So having a lot of species 1 creates competition among those individuals, and so it actually decreases its population size. However, it looks like the effect of species 1 on species 2 is to help it. So maybe species 1 is a prey and species 2 is a predator, and so then it grows. And you can see this is a very simple matrix where one species is hurting itself and it's facilitating the development of the next population, and then finally in the end the only one left is species 5, which promotes itself. So if we make a plot of this, then you get this function here. Sorry, it's a little blurry. X-axis is time, y-axis is population size. Start off with a full population of species 1. It's hurting itself, so its population declines. Species 2 is feeding off species 1 until it reaches its maximum size, and then it's contributing to species 3 and hurting itself, so it starts to go down. And each of these exhibit a similar function, but just with a more damped expression, until ultimately species 5 is the big winner and takes over the area. Okay, so that's an example of a statistical model where history is driving the future. Now we could look at another model that is the same type, but it's just focusing on an individual species. This is a model in which the growth rate of a species is exponential. So for example, if we look at this function here, y, which would be the population size at a time, is equal to the initial population size, y sub 0, times an exponential growth rate, which is just a function of time. So as time goes on, we get more and more of these at an exponential rate. If you take the derivative of this function with respect to time, then you'd get this function here. And what you can see is it just creates this curve, this exponential growth curve. This would suggest that population can grow infinitely into the future. And just as an example, if you look at human population growth, it may have been relatively linear for a long period of time, but since about 1500 AD, it has that characteristic J-shaped growth curve. Now, most recently, it may be starting to taper off, but it's just an example to give you a feel for what this kind of exponential growth would look like. A more realistic approach would be to say that a population can grow very fast at first, but eventually something is going to limit its growth, like running out of food or other resources. And so mathematically, we can create a function that's shown here, which says that the rate of growth of a population is proportional to its size, but also as it's growing, then it's going to reach a limit. And that limit is defined by, growth is, if I want to say that the growth rate equals 0, then I can solve for the population size when you reach that limit, and that equals A over B. And we can just call that capital K as the carrying capacity, and it gives you this S-shaped curve where initially you're growing like it's going to be exponential, but then you top out and you can't get past that carrying capacity. So this is again a case of a species either limiting itself through primarily through competition for, say, available resources that are there. Okay, so now we're going to go from one equation to two. We're going to look at abundance of two different species, and in one case we're going to have a prey, and in the other a predator. So the growth of the prey is going to hinge on its own exponential growth, but it's also going to be hurt by the interaction of the predators. So as the more predators are available, they're going to be eating the prey, and so it's going to go down. So we have a negative y factor here because y is the abundance of the predator. On the other hand, here we're going to have the growth of the predator species, and the more predators they are, then it's going to be affecting itself, and they can be naturally dying off. But it's actually going to be positively facilitated by the abundance of the prey. And when we solve those equations, you get something like this, where the prey species abundance increases. In this case, the prey is hare, and the predator are lynx. And so the prey species is going to grow. And then, secondarily, the predator's population is going to grow. And there's going to be a delay in those growth rates, that predators will grow after prey, but once the predator gets to a certain size, now it's eating so many prey that the prey abundance goes down, and then the predators go down, and then that allows the prey to come back. And so you see that there's this cyclicity. Nothing ever goes to zero, though. Like, there's no pure winner or loser. The species are tied to each other. Another way of representing this is to just make a plot of 1 versus 2 without having time as a factor. And what you can see is that for any given initial abundance of the population sizes of 1 and 2, you end up just getting a circle here. So H here would be like the hare, and P would be the predator. And so the population sizes, as hares would increase, but then eventually the predators would increase and the prey would decrease. And so it just creates this circular stability effect. Okay, so just to pause for a second, because as always, I go pretty fast. Consider that so far I've shown you a couple of different models of population growth that are used in ecology. And in the first case, it was based on the historical population size and the effect of other species on itself. Now we've moved to some more specific equations that aren't just linear functions in a matrix, but are nonlinear functions that account for both the carrying capacity of individual species and predator-prey relations. However, there's no explicit role for the environment. I mean, potentially in terms of the carrying capacity, the environment is playing a role, but is nothing that's explicit. Okay, so we're not going to get to the effect of the environment yet, but we're going to move on a little bit more. So now we want to, in this first case here, we were allowing the prey to grow at its own exponential rate. And for the predator, we weren't having an interspecific competition. So now we want to add that greater complexity. So let me just pause here and define some things. So intraspecific competition is the term we use when individuals of the same species are competing with each other. Okay, so here, for example, I've got 5 kangaroo rats. They have a bag of rat food, and there's only so much food, so there's less than would meet the metabolic requirements of all 5 of those. So, 1 or 2 of those might end up starving over time. Now, interspecific competition, it's not predation. It's where you have a resource like food, but now we have 3 kangaroo rats and 3 deer mice. And there isn't enough food for all these individuals, so perhaps one of them is going to get to the food more than the other, and if that continues over a long enough time, then one of these species would go away. Okay, so now what we want to do is put intraspecific competition and interspecific competition into a set of equations that will predict the population size of these 2 species. And what I'm essentially doing here is, like, compared to that historical model that was in a matrix, I'm showing you that with just 2 species, we start to get some very complex behaviors, and you can imagine it would get pretty hard if you add more and more species into this model. So here are 2 equations, and I'll unpack them for you. The first term in each equation is the growth rate for that species. N1 is the population size of the first species. N2 is the population size of the second species. dN1 dt just means the change of population size through time, so that's the growth rate, equal to R1 N1. That's essentially saying, like, we're going to have exponential growth. But R1 is the intrinsic growth rate, so that would be limited by environmental factors, food availability, and so forth. If you bring that R1N1 into here, K1 over K1 just gives you R1N1. And then if you multiply it here, you get R1N1 squared over K1. And so that is essentially, like, if you take this part of it that I'm circling right now, you're essentially just getting a carrying capacity equation here. So remember, this is AY minus BY squared. That's the same thing here. If you come back to here, it's like R1 would be like A, and R1, K1 would be the A factor, and then N1 minus N1 squared. So the first part of this is the carrying capacity effect, and then the second part of it here, the last part of it, is the effect of population size 2 on population 1. And then alpha 1, 2 is that, the interspecific competition factor. And we have the same thing for the others. So this is a model that looks at the effect of competition within a species and competition between species. Again, it doesn't count explicitly for environmental variables, but K and R would, in effect, have to be determined based on resource and environmental factors. Now let's take the first equation. Let's let the growth rate equal 0. So if we set that to 0, then we can divide both sides of the equation by R1N1. 0 divided by R1N1 means 0, so that goes away. Similarly, we can take K1, bring it over. 0 divided by K1 is 0, so that goes away. So we're just left with what's inside here equals 0. And if I rearrange that to isolate N2, I get a nice linear function. It tells me that the population size of N2 when N1 is not growing equals this constant minus N1, basically a linear function N1. This is an equation of a line because it's like y equals mx plus b. And in this case, m, the slope of the function, is a negative 1 over alpha 1, 2, and b, which is the intercept, is k1 over alpha 1, 2. So in a case where I set the population size of N1 to 0, then the size of N2 is going to be given by this factor here. So that would be what happens when we have interspecific competition. With intraspecific competition, so now I'm going to set N2 equals 0, so N2, the second population isn't affecting it, then N1 can basically just grow to its carrying capacity. If you go back to the original equation, it says growth is proportional to the carrying capacity equation plus this interspecific competition. Well, if I set N2 to 0, then we just go to that carrying capacity. And so this yellow line shows the line that's given by these two N members in this equation. And you can see that in this function, N1 will be growing until you hit that line. We could do the same thing with the second equation, and you get this other dynamic here where in the absence of interspecific competition, so you only have intraspecific competition, we're going to grow to the carrying capacity, and otherwise we could grow until we get to this other factor. So now we have these two different lines, and the problem is that these two lines, the yellow line and the red line, can be put together in 4 different ways. The first 2 ways are shown here. So in the left case here, what ifs for species 1, like species 1 is really powerful, okay? And the effect of species 2 is minimal. It's like, you're just a little bug in my life. I don't care about you. But, species 1 is really fighting with itself, lots of competition. In that case, the yellow line trumps the red line, which is shown as pink here. And so species 1, like initially, if we were to start with low population sizes of both, they both would have the ability to grow because there wouldn't be enough species 1 to wipe out species 2. But once they got past the line that represents that interaction relative to species 2, then species 1 really takes over and the whole population grows to the carrying capacity of species 1, and species 2 just goes away. So this is a winner-take-all scenario. And the reason why there are different lines here is because depending on what the initial state of the system is, how would you start in all these different states? But, let's say you had a large population size of both species. You would be beyond both of their carrying capacities. They'd both be starving and dying off until you hit this line, and then they would just drive towards the carrying capacity of species 1. Now let's look at the other scenario. Same idea, we've just flipped the lines, and so now species 2 is going to win. So species 2, it's really strong. Species 1 is really pathetic, and species 2 wins. The more interesting scenarios happen when they have different things that are going on. So now, let's say that the competition that's induced between each species is more of a factor than the competition that's internal to those species. So basically, they can really hurt each other, but they aren't necessarily hurting themselves. If you start with small population size, let's say you start with a lot of N1 and a little bit of that population 2, you drive up until you hit the line that represents its limits, and then at that point, population 2 is going to be able to keep growing until you reach the point where its own, let's see, wait, oh, I actually said that backwards, so I have to apologize. Okay, this is the case where the intraspecific competition is greater than interspecific competition. So they're not hurting each other. They're basically not minding each other, and they're hitting their own carrying capacities. So in this case, species 2 can grow until it's reaching its carrying capacity, and it's essentially unaffected by competition. And species 1 can grow to its carrying capacity, and it's unaffected by the competition. So I apologize for getting that backwards. If both start with large population sizes, then sure, now you're going to have both intra and interspecific competition. And so everything then gets driven to this very stable point where you have a presence of both species. So because I made a mistake, which is always human and good to do, let me just summarize that again by saying that if each species is more impacted by its own intraspecific competition, then it's going to be limiting its own growth through carrying capacity constraints. So if it gets too big, then it's going to tend to self-regulate. Or if it gets too big, only then can interspecific competition have an effect. And so everything is going to be driven towards this equilibrium point. Now let's go back to what I thought I was talking about, which is this scenario over here, scenario 3. If the competition induced by the other species is bigger than carrying capacity, then what's going to happen is it all depends on the population sizes. So if you have a lot of population 2 and not a lot of population 1, then population 2 is really going to be hurting population 1, and that's going to allow population 2 to grow, and eventually you reach the carrying capacity of population 2. And then conversely, if you have a lot of population 1 and not a lot of population 2, then it's going to drive towards a winner of population 1. And so in this case, you're basically going to have a winner, but who wins just depends on the initial population sizes, because interspecies competition is a stronger effect than intraspecies competition. Okay, so that's a good point to pause. If you want to take a break, this would be a good point to just pause and take a break. And just to summarize, I've shown you models so far that are primarily population-driven models. Now we're going to switch to models that are still have competition, but are more appropriate for trees and are models that focus more on the environmental effects. And these are called individual-based ecological models. So what we're going to do, is we're going to try to assess what's going on in the environment. We're going to look at the interactions between trees, but we're also going to be looking at the role of environmental factors. So we have to know what drives the growth of trees, and this is individual-based model because now, instead of solving for population size like we were doing before, we're actually going to make a model of every individual tree and see what happens to that tree. So trees, we want to know how it grows. Is it going to die? Is it being shaded out? What is that tree up against? And to do this, we're going to use a type of model that's called a gap model. So a gap is an opening in a canopy that might be created by a death of a tree. So into that hole, then new saplings can grow, new seeds can germinate, and then that space is going to get filled. So I'm going to summarize the approach, and then I'll show you the equations. The basic workflow is that you're going to start with bare ground or just an initial forest state that may not even have a gap. You're going to determine whether any trees were born or died, and of course if they're dying, then they're creating a gap. Then for every tree, you're going to have the growth of the tree as a function of environmental conditions and the effects of other trees on that tree. We're going to have then the overall change in the environment because now you have changes in shading as trees have grown. We're going to then look at the subsequent distribution of tree growth under the new environmental regime, and then you repeat this process over and over. And each of these models takes a slightly different approach to how it does this. Is this yeah, okay. So one example of these models is a model called Jabo, and I haven't provided the citation, but it's easy enough to just look that up on the internet. And so typically what we have is we're going to say that the growth of the tree is a function of its current size, also affected by the maximum potential size of that species of tree. And then all of that has to be adjusted by the actual environmental conditions. Like, hey, if it's really dry or it's not enough light, then there's going to be harm to that tree. And so you can see here in this equation, d squared h, that's the volume of the tree. If you think of a tree as a cylinder, h is the height and d squared is like the area. So that's the volume of the tree. So the change in that volume through time is going to be a function of the essentially like maximum net assimilation rate, like that's the growth rate of the tree. Then leaf area index comes into play. And leaf area index, you can see in turn, is a function of the diameter of the tree. And then we just have this function that tells us that depending on, it's essentially the growth rate is a function of the current size of the tree relative to the maximum. So what this is saying is that if the tree is near its maximum size, then this is going to approach 1, and that's going to make the growth rate go to 0. If you have a very small value here, so the tree is very small, then it's going to have a maximal growth rate. And then F, E, and V is saying function of the environment, and I'll show you those environmental modifiers. These essentially are scaled like from 0 to 1, or maybe a little bit higher than 1 if it's helping, like a bonus. And so I'll show you those scaling factors in a minute. So D is usually going to be it's the diameter of a tree, and H is going to be a function of diameter. So this is basically saying that all the aspects of a tree in terms of its geometry, height and diameter and stuff, they're all interconnected. And that's called the allometrics of a tree, and I'll show you more of that in a minute. So this just shows an example. If you have an individual tree and you have one of these types of function, over a 200-year period, the tree is going to grow, which is the solid line, and that's the diameter of breast height, dBH, which is just given as D in the equation. And then if you take the derivative of that, then you get this other function that shows, hey, it's going to grow the most early on, but then after 50 or 60 years, then its rate of growth will start to decline. Okay, so here's an example of a relationship, one of these allometric relationships between height and diameter. So height is a function of diameter. And so just go out, measure a bunch of trees, and you'll find that taller trees also have bigger diameters. So what about these environmental functions? Well, like I said, they're typically going to scale from 0 to 1, which means that as a multiplier, if you take something here and let's say it's 0.5, it's going to be reducing the growth rate. So according to a gap model, the effect of the environment can only be bad, unless it has a bonus component, which you'll see some do. But so the key environmental factors that are considered tend to be light related, and that's the effect of one tree shading another tree. There could be like temperature, wind, and rain effects, soil quality, and nutrient availability. So light is a huge factor when you're talking about trees, because trees have the ability to shade each other out, and some trees are shade tolerant and some are intolerant. So these equations get pretty complex, and I'm not going to expect you to know them, but just think about the idea of it. And the idea is that the light intensity at a certain height in a tree is given by this function here, which is a function of, like a light extinction coefficient, and then this distributed, the distribution of available light. I think LA is like available light as a function of height. And so the relative growth performance of the tree then depends on the light that's available, which is in this QH term here. And these functions would be different whether it's a shade tolerant or shade intolerant tree. Okay, so then, let's see here. Get a little bit of brightness here because I'm getting some darkness. So soil quality and temperature functions. Well, let's say you have a gap, and then in that gap, there is a maximum capability of that soil to serve the trees that are in it. As you have a lot of crowding that's taking place, like BA is basal area, so as you get bigger and bigger in here, then the growth performance goes down. Here's a temperature-dependent model where growth performance has an optimal temperature here. So annual degree days, that's the effective temperature on photosynthetic rates. And so it just has this U-shaped, like dome function. It's given by this here. So notice again that these functions scale from 0 to 1. So in general, like if temperature isn't a factor at all for a particular species, then it's just going to be a 1. But it is a chance that if you're not at the optimal temperature, then it's going to hurt the growth. So you have to take that function, get that 0 to 1 value, and plug it in here for F, E, and V. Okay. So that's how we're going to grow a tree. So then trees can also be born, and the number of saplings that are added to the stand each year are going to depend on different things. If the tree is tolerant of shade, let's just start there. It doesn't care whether it's shady or not. Then we just simply say we're going to have a random number between 0 to 1, and then SI is the maximum number of saplings. So that could be obtained by doing a seed dispersal study for that tree. For shade intolerant species, now it's going to be a function of available light as well as any site quality or other environmental factors. Tree death can occur for two reasons. If a tree is very old, then the older it gets, the likelihood of it dying is going to go up, and so we'll have a random number generated to represent that. And then there's also the competition-induced stress. So if a tree is getting shaded out more and more, then it's going to be growing less and less, and eventually it's going to die. Okay, so let me just motivate this with an example. There was a really cool article published in Science several years ago, and I've given you the link to Science Magazine below, but there's been a lot of applications of this individual-based model called sorting. It's going to go with how I've described. The first step is you have trees, each individual tree, and for each tree we're going to assess how much light that tree is receiving. We're going to put that into a growth function. So here, like, these two green trees are the same species, and then this like mustardy dark brown olive tree has its growth rate. And so growth rate here would be based on available resources and light, and so it's going to grow. There's also going to be a chance of mortality, and then there's a reproduction where you have seed dispersal, and then we just cycle around. Now this is really hard to read. I don't expect you to memorize this. The important thing is to just look at what we have here, like tree allometry. Okay, so the height and the diameter of the tree are related, and this little thing here just shows a function between D and H. And I already showed you an example of that. All the way back here was that kind of function for a particular species. We're also going to have crown allometry, so that the diameter of the crown could be a function of crown height or vice versa. Growth function. So here's the function in this case for what that is. That's going to allow the tree to grow. A mortality function, a seed dispersal function, and then a shading effect. Now, one of the things that you can do with a model like this is you can parameterize it to get the effects of different trees represented. So two of the important things that happen is that you have different degrees of shade tolerance. And the code for these letters is given on the next slide in the upper right. So BE stands for beech, HM stands for hemlock, and YB is yellow birch. So from left to right, you go from species that are shade tolerant and don't really care, like beech and hemlock, to ones that really don't want to be shaded. And that would be like pretty much everything else. The vertical axis here represents different growth strategies. Yellow birch is one that is really good at dispersing its seeds far away into a gap, and so it can colonize a gap and into the middle of a gap where other species can't. Whereas, like, let's see, WP is like white pine, RO is red oak, hemlock. These are species that if you have an opening and they're adjacent to it, then they can disperse, and all of those can grow quickly. Like on the right, these shade-intolerant species are all ones that can grow fast relative to the shade-tolerant ones, but how they disperse and grow is different. So let's look at how this individual based model works. So here's a square, and in this square, each color here represents an individual tree. And then they do a clear cut, but leave 10% of the seedlings with diversity of tree types in there. Now take that cut and look at it 100 years later, 500 years later, and 1,000 years later. And if you go to the website, you can get the animations and look at this, how it changes through time. What you can see is for a partial clear cut with 10% seeds remaining, you do see a lot of this rapidly growing, easily dispersing yellow birch, which is why it's yellow, coming in. But you do see other species in there, and 1,000 years later, there's a mix of all these different species. If we look at a complete clear cut, now it's quite different. So now the yellow birch is able to shoot its seeds far out and grow a monocultural stand of yellow birch, and even 1,000 years later, it's staying robust. With 4 smaller clear cuts, you see a blend of the two. I mean, it does help some to have a smaller clear cut, but really what matters more is keeping some seedlings in there to maintain that diversity. Another way of looking at the results is looking through time on the x-axis. Y-axis is the basal area, square meters per hectare of each type of tree. And in the undisturbed case, you see a species like beech and hemlock to a lesser extent. Those are the ones that are shade tolerant and that they can win over time. Like, give it enough time, they will outcompete the yellow birch. And you can see that the yellow birch crashes. However, with a disturbed state, the yellow birch grows and grows and grows and then can hold steady. Okay, the very last thing I want to show you is a simulation of a Douglas fir dwarf mistletoe in sickness. So you can read through this here on your own if you want to pause. But basically, dwarf mistletoe is attacking Douglas fir. And there's a model called the Forest Vegetation Simulator that can simulate this. And so on the left, we'll see a forest stand and these individual base scout model impacted with mistletoe, and on the right is one without that. And I've given you the web link, and so what you're going to see is that you see the thinning of the forest, the downing of the wood on the left, and on the other hand, on the right, you just see that the species, the individuals that are there, just grow and basically are able to survive. And so, 100 years later, you can see a significant difference with dwarf mistletoe present or not. So let's just summarize what I've tried to show, and this is really just your beginning introduction to ecological models. First, we had population models. They're simple equations. They're what we call parsimonious. That is, that they don't include a lot of complexity to them. They're trying to get at the essential behavior of individual species, usually in relation to other species, and greatly simplifying environmental effects. The results are predetermined by whatever parameters you put in to characterize like carrying capacity and intrinsic rate of growth. Statistical models are very simple to run. Actually, in this lecture, I didn't show the Markov chain, so don't worry about that. And then the individual based models are much more realistic because they're tracking every individual tree rather than the population scale. But of course, then you have a highly stochastic component in terms of birth and death and other factors. They're very demanding. Note that they're not accounting for topography, which is a fundamental control in the distribution of water availability, light availability, nutrients, a lot of other factors. So they're really just very rudimentary start at trying to get at an eco-hydrological model. So we can summarize by saying that in the same way that hydrological models are not necessarily taking a lot of account of ecology, this first tier of ecological models that I've shown you here to get it started similarly does not show a lot of hydrology. But we will be looking at models that do go into that more. And I hope it wasn't too distracting as I lost my daylight behind me. But I think this was still good. So we'll see.